All right. I think most of the people supposed to join already joined, so we can go and get started. We'll begin with some quick introductions. Will, let's start with you. If you'd like to give a quick intro.
Sure. Hi, all. My name is Will Angel. I work at Caribou Financial as a senior technical product manager, and I help lead our data engineering team to build and manage our data infrastructure here so that our analytics team can help Caribou save more people more money on their cars.
Thanks so much, Will. Over to you, Nikki.
Hey everyone, my name is Nicky Parseghian. I head up our IT strategy and services team over here at SADA. I've been with the company 17 years, and we are a premier Google Cloud partner based in North America, but with presence worldwide. We advise customers and help them essentially make the use of the entire Google Cloud stack.
Cool. Thanks so much, Nikki.
Sure thing.
To round it up, I'm Xavier. I will be your moderator for today. I'm one of the co-founders of Caster and COO, and I'm a former data scientist, so I also faced firsthand the topic that we're going to address today, which is around trust and transparency, and especially like I kind of felt what it's like to be in companies where it's not always well done. So really excited to learn more from Will and Nikki on that topic. To begin this session, we'll just spend a quick 5 minutes to set the context and then spend the bulk of our time today on the panel with Will and Nikki. Questions are encouraged. You can submit them on the bottom right corner of the screen, and we'll try to go through as many as we can at the end of this session. Let's go to it. So today, as company grows and as the world evolves, there's just like much more investment in data tools, more people working with data, and that results in much more data projects. So there's just simply much more data stakeholders with access to data than ever before. That just creates a lot of chaos all over the company, and it's just really hard to build trust. And access to the data is really different than usage of the data. It's two different things. For data to create value, people have to really trust it. And because people won't use data, they don't trust. So this really is like how to find the right balance between like the more projects that you're building and the right level of trust that you can put so that whatever is coming out of the data project is relevant. On the flip side, we know that trust is essential to be used, but it's a big and broad goal. And that will be the subject of our conversation is where do we start? But we'll save that answer to the conversation with Will and Nikki. But there's also another important factor that plays here is transparency. And I just want to maybe dig a bit into that concept, because building trust in your data is easier said than done. It's sometimes easier to just like bring transparency to enable trust. Indeed, transparency is really critical to help people find the data that they need and understand the context behind it. So if people can find and understand the data, they can build a better trust and ultimately be able to use and get as much value out of the data. So transparency is kind of a vehicle to achieve trust, and trust is really the end goal here. So for those who haven't guessed it yet, the big goal for today's session is for you to walk away with some really practical tips on how to deliver data trust and transparency, drawing experience from Nikki and Will's journey. Especially because data trust and transparency are really high-level concepts. It's always nicer and easier to dive into like what's happening on the field and go through concrete example of like real people who's been there and been through that journey. So that's the objective of that session. Now we'll close this out and turn to the discussion. Will, as you mentioned in the introductions, you are a senior technical product manager for data engineering at Caribou. Can you tell us a bit more about the data team at Caribou, your functions, the data team's function within the company?
Absolutely. So, in my role as the technical product manager, I help lead our data engineering team to build, deploy, and manage our data tools and infrastructure so that our analysts and data scientists across the organization can make better use of their data. And part of that also involves building new integrations, ETL, ELT, to acquire data for them.
Cool. Thanks so much, Will. That's really helpful question for also my next question. There's a lot of buzz out there around like data as a product. What are your thoughts on this, and specifically as it pertains to the data product lifecycle?
Yeah, that is a great question. So data as a product means, I'd say, two things to me, both of which are really good and make any kind of data work more effective. So the first way that I would define data as a product, and the way I see it being defined in industry, is to bring a product management mindset to your data and analytics projects, which means thinking about how your dashboard or data will be used by people in a way that's valuable to them, feasible to actually build, and desirable for the business to have, which practically means taking some extra time when you're building, say, a dashboard or a predictive model to think about who's actually going to use it and how it's going to be valuable for them, which you'd think is common sense when it comes to building a dashboard or an analytics project, but sometimes the cart gets put before the horse and we start training models and look at the accuracy as opposed to what the business impact is. So the first aspect of data as a product is product mindset for data. The second definition, and this is the one that I think is really interesting, is treating your data assets, your dashboards, your tables, your data sets as products. And this means having things like the documentation that you would expect a product to come with and meeting a certain level of reliability. If you have a real physical product, that's something that if it's a piece of junk, you're not going to buy it again. If you get some junk off Amazon, you're not going to buy it again. And you expect it to come with a certain level of quality, again, documentation. And that means that when you're thinking about data in that regard, you also have to think about the life cycle of that data. And there, with a physical product, you design the product, you create it, it gets used, and then eventually thrown away. And if you're creating your product sustainably, you want to think about that whole life cycle and plan for the safe usage, storage, and eventual disposal of your product at the end of its life cycle. And when it comes to data, that means thinking about how you'll store the data, how you'll document the data, how it will actually get used and be useful. And then also, once the data is no longer useful, how you're going to eventually deprecate and or delete it.
Cool. I really like that analogy around like the real life product life cycle, or like physical objects, or even like other type of products, and the fact that there's documentation, like specific, also like workflows for deletion, etc. Because just like it's also important to just like put the focus on the latest, like the latest and greatest of any kind of products. Sorry, I'm a bit sick, so I have something. So cool. That's super interesting. Nicky, I'd love to hear your perspective on this, and especially like you have responsibility at SADA over operationalizing the company's data. what is your take on the data product lifecycle as you work towards your goal? And more specifically, like, how do you see the data product lifecycle in the context of data transparency? How does that improve data transparency?
Yeah, so sure. First, thanks, Will, for providing that answer. He provided a more customer centric with the user interface, obviously being at the heart. Me being more on the back end, obviously it's more focused on the data itself. But it may sound obvious to a lot of folks, right? Especially coming from a tech guy. But the data that you have is only pertinent if you put enough effort producing it, right? If you just like whip something out real quick and deliver it in 2 hours, obviously there's going to be quite a few flaws in the report. And tomorrow, if we ask you for the same data, you're not going to come up with the same conclusion, right? So when we look at it, quite often organizations see data warehousing as, to put it simply, like a mass load of your content sources. Just take all of our data over here, put it in the data warehouse, we're going to consume it, it's going to be great, right? But it never works the right way, because you're just transposing essentially a big, very complex, purpose-built infrastructure architecture into another thing. You still have to figure out essentially what it is, right? The approach that we're taking quite often is different. I'm a big advocate of the KISS principle. For those of you that do not know it, and to put it nicely, it's to keep it super simple, right? That's the concept. So when you're producing data, you want to get straight to the point. You want to capture the requirements, get the right definitions, know what you measure pretty much, right? Get all in agreements. Then, of course, you're going to work through the data, understand how it's laid out in there, how do you produce the results, and then deliver it. And so as you will go through that, we'll produce over time a lot of very similar queries. A bunch of different business units are going to ask you very similar questions, and you're going to answer with very similar things. Quite often, as a data analyst, you're going to see your analyst, they're going to take their queries, they're going to make some tweaks to it, and re-deliver it. Right? So as you evolve, essentially, you will find yourself that you will enhance your data sets, right? You're going to find something that is going to produce the data faster, or you're going to find new conditions, or you're going to bring in new variables from the business that will help you essentially reframe essentially the question, the definition, the problem that you're trying to answer. So you will going to spend more and more time, right? And you need to do that. That's a product life cycle, pretty much aspect of it. You will need to re-optimize the previous queries, the previous dashboards, the previous deliverables that you've produced to make sure that they're up to par. Because as you mature, you want your entire base to mature, and not say like, this was built 6 months ago. It was my old me, my 2021 me. Don't think about it, right? Like, you really want the entire framework essentially to go up. So you're going to do that by curating your data sets, moving your old queries to more curated data sets, and keep on iterating over and over again.
Yeah, I like that idea of just like iteration. I'm not the product guy here, but Arnaud, which is the CPO at Castor, would really love that discussion. He would, I think, also like to add something around like the intent around like each data set. Like, he would start asking like, why do you want to like create that data set, and then like from there just like go really deep into the reason, and then start documenting that reason, and then from there like start with a very simple like data set dashboard, and then grow from there, iterating on that like that dashboard data set, so that we start bringing more and more value that is aligned with that really core essence of the why. I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, he really likes asking why. Every question is there.
Yeah,
why? Oh, I knew that. I can
I
feel it.
guess every time you talk to him, it's just like, oh, well, you want that feature.
And
Why?
of course, the answer to why is it depends.
Yeah, obviously.
Of course.
And also, I didn't know about the KISS principle. I'm gonna actually go through the recording of this this video to just like write it down, because I really liked it. Thanks, Nicky. I really love that. On the topic of data transparency, one of the themes that you mentioned as well is like the importance of having everyone speak the same language. Can you elaborate a bit on like why this is a priority at SADA, and how you've made progress on this front?
Yeah, I think I can use an example that happened, this past week or a few weeks ago, pretty much, right? When budgeting season for the new year, right? Like it's that time of the year, pretty much, where we're being asked a lot of metrics to help understand our current performance, but also budget forecasts for the upcoming year, so that the entire structure and the entire business essentially can get in marching orders, right? So they keep on asking us for a flurry of metrics. It happens every day. Now, if I ask everyone on this webinar right now, what's a good definition for revenue? I'm pretty sure I'm going to get quite a few responses, right? And rightfully so, because depending on which side of the business you are, right? If you're in finance, you're going to have a definition. If you're in sales operations, you're going to have another one. If you're a sales rep, you're going to have another one, because it affects everybody's bottom line at the end of the day, right? Like, hey, you want to report on GAAP, for instance, right? Revenue is very strict. If you're trying to attain a sales quota, you kind of need to know exactly what constitutes revenue, so you can get your accelerators, your margin, your commissions, and all that, right? So at the end of the day, if we don't speak the same language, right, we're going to have dire results in there, because one report is going to show something, the other one is going to show completely something else. And you're going to get up with a lot of angry people that will yell at each other, but eventually they'll turn to you, right, saying like, what the hell is this data that you just produced, right? So at the end of the day, the common denominator that is there is, in fact, data, right? You're a representative of data. And that data is produced based on a set of rules, the conditions, and finding that right recipe, getting everybody to agree on what the right definition is paramount, right? So when we at SADA evaluated essentially solutions, right, data catalog solutions, we focused in on two things for us. The first one was the ability to create those definitions, which is usually just a set of documents, let's face it, right? But being able to apply those definitions to the data sets, and most importantly, the fields in the data sets, was what appealed to us, because we want to say this metric is calculated based on this method, this formula, right? And so the second component that we were looking for as well was a data lineage tool that, hey, if you want to actually look at the content of this column, you can see it's coming from these three different tables, for instance, right? And this is how essentially that sausage is made. So to us, those were like two critical components in there, because they help us truly define what is the right definition for X, Y, Z, and therefore all speak the same language at the organization.
And I'll just add there that in a previous role at a different company as a data analyst, I once spent 6 straight weeks getting us down to, I think, 3 different definitions of retention, because there was a data brawl, like Nicky said, where, my boss at the time, the chief marketing officer, had different numbers than the finance people, and they kept talking past each other and getting into conflicts over, was retention 30%? Was it 35%? Which mattered a lot. So having that transparency and consistency around metrics is very important.
Yeah, I completely agree, and I can actually really relate to that. You mentioned the budgeting season. Even when we were like 5 to 10 at Caster, we had I think 3 to 5 different definitions of what the revenue was, just because is it signed contract? Is it money that we already have in the bank account? Is it what really is the is it the accounting definition? Is it the growth definition? Just so many things. And people tend to optimize for the metric that they think is the right one. So if you're a finance person trying to optimize for the finance definition of revenue, then you're just going to just put all your effort into that direction, and it's not necessarily the same one as marketing or anything else. So it's kind of having a lot of impact on how are the different people in the company going to put their focus. And it's just easier to have everyone put their energy towards the same goal, which just makes a lot of sense here. This kind of maybe overstep on part of the next question that I wanted to ask you, Will, is when you think about data trust and transparency, what are some of the top reasons that this is important for you at Caribou? And on the flip side, like what are the risks and or the opportunity costs of not putting dedicated resources on these areas?
Yeah. So to be concise, I'd say that data transparency and trust results in more value from data in less time with greater quality and accuracy and less suffering. Like I said, I've worked as a data analyst, and I've personally experienced the pain of people not trusting my analysis because they didn't trust the underlying data, and either because they weren't able to see that it was good, or because it wasn't trustworthy. And so there's a real cost in terms of time, effort, and speed to making decisions if you don't have transparent and trustworthy data. So there, you end up with a lot of repetitive questions, meetings, lots of questions in Slack. It's just so many meetings if your data isn't trustworthy. A couple of practical things that I do to try and increase transparency and trust is, like Nicky said, architecture. Being consistent with how your data is organized really helps people get that standard language to talk about it. And it doesn't have to be complex. You can sort of group data sets logically by source, by department, by domain. But if you organize the data well and consistently across those groupings, it makes it much easier for people to talk about, is this the raw data? Is this, some like downstream table? Having that language and vocabulary across the data consumers in your organization is very helpful. The second practical tip I'd say is documentation. If you write down what the data means, where it came from, and any known issues with it, that works. Like if there is a known defect with some data that hasn't been fixed yet, just having that documented is enough to improve trust in the data. And then the other thing I'd say is embrace reproducibility. You really, really, really do not want to be in a place where you have ghost spreadsheets floating around your organization, where someone emails you an Excel file and says, "Hey, why is my data bad?" Because then you're in a situation where you don't know where they got the data from, you don't know the lineage of that, and you really just can't see it. And most of us, I think, work in a modern data stack world where you usually have good lineage of things. But at the end of the day, people are going to download your data and dump it into Excel. So making sure that those people have the tools and knowledge needed to, instead of downloading the file, setting up a server connection into Excel, that goes a long way.
I like that idea of like finding, or like someone asking a question about a data set, like not giving you any information, like what's the context behind it, and they have no clue as well. And it feels like I like to use that example of like, it's just like if you found in the street a paper with a number on it, like, I don't know, 10 digits, and like you're just like, this paper is useless if you don't have any context about it. But if you know that those are the 10 digits that are going to make you win the lottery, then you can just go to the next shop and just be like, hey, I'm going to use that for the lottery, and then you can be rich, So just knowing where the data comes from, what's behind it, and like what is the context of like the data you're looking at, just like can be the difference between like super high value or no value at all. So really like understand that flip side. I think my example is just like super like high level of like an image of like how this can be explained to a kid, but this really is the gist of it. Nicky, you kind of talked about this already a bit, but I'd like you to elaborate. We've talked about like why data transparency and trust are important, but I'm really curious about like, what does it actually mean to have like transparent and trustworthy data on a day-to-day basis, and especially like how might these like definitions differ within the data team and the broader company or like how do you align like the business and the data team on those like transparent, trustworthy data?
Yeah, we'll talk a little bit about it, right? When like nobody's perfect. The data that you're gonna have is not gonna be perfect, but documenting it, even like we're not talking about like a 10-page document that goes through 5 levels of review. Just a simple documentation outlining what it is for, what defects it may have, right? Like, hey, we don't have this data set yet. We haven't turned this one, right? So we just like jerry rig something off of a spreadsheet, right? To use that for reference for the time being. Having that set level of transparency so that people can understand what business decisions and therefore what calculated risk they're making essentially based on that data is primordial, right? For us at SADA, we have for the longest time, I think like 10 years or so, we've had 5 core values in the organization. One of them is be data driven, right? And being data driven is really like that we can make those purposeful decisions and take calculated risk fueled by the internal analysis of data. So depend on the data that you have, make the right analysis, trust that the data is correct, right? Obviously, because it's a core value, right? You don't want to, sling some things to the folks, but rely on the data that you have to make your business decisions. So being able to have transparent and trustworthy data allows the business to not cast a doubt or not argue to one another to say like, why is this 50% or 200% of the projected values or whatnot? Like, no, they can just bypass that and just get to the point and try to find essentially the right solution for the business, right? Then they're not going to try to poke holes or cast doubt against the data. The data is part of the team, it's part of the company, right? This is something that supports an argument. So having transparent and trustworthy data will help in turn the organization to make more rational decisions and therefore win more. My boss will hate me in saying that because he's a big advocate of the infinite game and therefore you never win, right? You continually improve. But yes, it will help you win more pretty much.
Cool, love it. Will, do you have anything to add on like what good looks like for data transparency and trust based on your experience at Caribou?
Yeah, and I'll just add on to Nikki's comment about winning more, that there's this metaphor around like trust and relationships where you can think of trust as a jar full of marbles, and whenever you do something right, you put in a marble. So whenever the data is there and useful and is correct, whoever looks at that, they put in a marble. And so as they just go through their normal day, they're putting marbles into this trust jar. And then when there's an incident or a place where the data doesn't mean what they think it does, they go and grab a big handful of marbles and they throw them at you. Or well, they just take them out and the jar has less marbles in it. And they're like, I like to think about trust when it comes to data as how often is your data helping people put marbles in that trust jar, because the more trustworthy it is, the more room you as a data team have to make mistakes and go quickly. And there's, I think, an optimal amount of transparency and trust because it's never going to be perfect. There's always going to be some change in the environment. Maybe it's an upstream system. Maybe it's a change in how the business works, a change in some process that means that the data no longer reflects reality. Like, you can't stop that from happening. So the data is never going to be 100% trustworthy. But being 80, 90, 95% trustworthy is way better than being 0 or -% trustworthy. It can go negative. And if your data is not trustworthy enough, eventually people are going to stop being data-driven because they don't trust the data, so they'll go with their gut. So when it comes to some of the specifics about what good looks like here, sort of like I said, organized and documented. Modern data warehouses allow you to throw a lot of data in, like Nikki said, and they don't require a consistent architecture. So it's really easy to turn your data warehouse into or your data lake into a data swamp. And that's no good for trustworthiness.
Garbage in, garbage out.
Exactly, the classic saying. I like that idea about marbles. Makes me think of like the I have the kind of the same thing with like fruits. It's just like if you have a bad fruit into like a fruit can, it just like kind of like go through all the other fruits like really fast. So there's also that idea of like once you have like compromised data, you have like a responsibility to just remove that data as fast as possible before it kind of like affects the trust that people have on other data. So like the ability, and that's more on the data quality side of things, or there's a lot of like things that builds into trust, but like the ability of just identifying like which data sets aren't trustworthy and just removing them as fast as possible from that like data trust data sets is really important. That's super cool. Nikki, like from like your perspective at SADA, like what is the kind of upstream and downstream benefits that you have been seeing of having data trust and transparency? And especially, I'm curious about like um, your perspective since you've been moving from the client-facing side to owning like SADA's internal data management perspective. So kind of internal from and vs external perspective on that topic.
Sounds good. So, I mean, overall, in terms of upstream and downstream benefits, essentially, right, of building something transparent, there are numerous benefits, obviously, to make it more transparent. We talked about, the potential issues if you're not making it transparent with our definition of revenue, for instance, right? Uh, Being transparent overall doesn't mean make it public, right? So I want to caution that for everyone. Like, we're not saying that. We're saying we have to ensure that every stakeholder in whatever discussion that you're having, pretty much, right, understands which conditions, with parameters, essentially everyone agrees to when we're talking about something, right? Let's say, for instance, if a customer is churned or not, everybody understand what is the right definition for it, or what is the definition that we agree to, most important, rather than the right one, so that the business can more adequately strategize altogether. Right. So this is I think a very important one, and obviously you're going to have numerous upstream and downstream impacts to that because, right, of that agreement with all the parties. Now, as far as my vision is concerned, it hasn't really changed. It has evolved. Why is because I used to manage a professional services team for 6 years, and before that I was an individual contributor, an engineer, sales engineer. I'm coming from a development background. So my entire previous career at SADA, right, 16 years, I was client facing. So last year, our CEO asked me to take over and build data warehouse for the organization, and that's what I did. But my vision hasn't really changed. It's evolved. Why? Because I had my blinders on. Professional services, I had my revenue, I had my P&L, I had my goals, I had my objectives, I had my utilization rate to measure, I had my, like revenue numbers, targets, and so on and so forth. They were very specific, right? I had my blinders on, literally. So I was looking at it with a specific lens. And to me, it's like, of course, it was a de facto number because that's what I measured on, right? So, of course, it's the right definition. But pushing it to now internal, when I'm talking to a whole lot more pieces, essentially, the business, right? That is not just pro-serve delivery, but I'm talking about finance, FinOps, right? Customer success, operations, and all that. I've seen that those definitions are numerous, right? And everyone is as passionate as I was with their own definition, right? So being able to see that and see that passion that everybody has from a different angle just help us essentially understand as an organization that things need to evolve, right? Not necessarily change, but it helped me as an individual, I think, prioritize tasks differently and move specific items more up the ladder to make sure that we can have the right definitions earlier, and we can have, right, to Will's point earlier, with having like your data organized in a specific way. Help me also organize our data in a specific way to be able to say, like, I'm using this view view with a specific lens with that specific definition, but these created data tables pretty much are with that broader vision, pretty much. Does that answer your question, Xavier?
Yeah, perfect. Perfectly. I like that idea of like when you're like internal, or like when you have like your blinders on, you have like one unique perspective, whereas like if you move into more the data specific, like or the internal data management, you realize like how much different perspective there is around there. And one of the missions of the data management team is just helping people realize that they have blinders, and just like having blinders is not a problem in its own, as long as you're conscious that you have them. So that makes you more aware, or it's easier to and like to listen to some other people, because you know that they might have blinders as well. So you know that they can be kind of looking at things from a different perspective than you are, and you know that you have them as well. So you know that they have some other vision that can improve the way that you see the world, or you see your specific topics. And that is, I think that's really interesting. um, and I think that's one of the really like key mission and core vision of the data management team, and what data trust and transparency helps you to build. um, I had a final questions for both of you, Will and Nikki. What advice would you have for other data leaders as they took to uh, deliver like data transparency and trust in their organization? Like, what's the one thing you would like to say to someone that's starting that journey?
So the thing that I will say, which is both an
Except
answer to
except
this,
for except for putting Gester.
yeah. So the answer to that question, and a follow up to Nikki's comment about being focused on individual contributors being focused on metrics, sort of with those blinders on, get a modern data lineage tool so that you can see what the impact of upstream issues are with downstream reports, so that you, as as a data leader, as someone doing data management, can tell those individual contributors, hey, your numbers are going to be stale because of this pipeline outage. And that allows you to build trust with them even when things are breaking. So having a great lineage tool allows you to build trust in situations that normally would cost you trust. And when things are operating well, if there are any questions about how that number gets calculated, you can use those same lineage tools to say, oh, that number is pulling from these 3 different data sources and it's getting processed in these ways, which allows for more transparency and auditability and accountability. So a good lineage tool goes a long way for building trust.
Agreed. Very much so. For me, I think is going to be to keep it super simple, right? So the KISS methodology. When I was given the job and the role, we had some infrastructure that was built based on some principles, which were googly principles. So build at scale and load as much as you can, because hey, data is cheap. But at the end of the day, as I was interviewing stakeholders early on, right? Because you talk to people before you get started head on. I got a lot of feedback saying like, be careful, it's much bigger than you think, right? Like you got to put the right efforts, you got to build a massive team, you got to think about XYZ, and therefore this is why you need it at scale, and so on and so forth. But at the end of the day, nobody in their right mind will ask you to take something and from scratch pretty much and make it the pinnacle of excellence, right? Let's face it, like whoever is asking you that is not realistic. With that said, that's where we strive to be, right? It's a right target, it's a good vision. You just cannot overhaul everything overnight. So instead, what you got to do is you got to keep it simple, right? Like you got to keep it super simple, identify the areas where you can improve, and iterate one after the other, right? Equip yourself with the right tools and identifies those areas of opportunity. Just tackle them one after the other. It will take time, and it's okay, right? It's not a finite game. It's an infinite game, and at the end of the day, it's a life cycle, right? Like you will keep on iterating and continue on improving things, because by doing so, you will mature as an organization, and therefore you're going to become more and more reliable and dependable on the data that you produce. So to me, keep it super simple is the number one thing.
Yeah, completely agree, and that's an advice that can be broadened to all of the life topics, because it's just like something that we like forget all of like every single day. Just like keep it simple, start small, then grow that into like and just like take problems as they come in, so that you build when the right problems arrive. And I think that's really specifically true for data governance. It's been like already a really cool talk, a lot of interesting insights. I think it might be time to move for into the Q&A. So I was just browsing through the quick questions there. I think there is a first question that is really interesting, is what is the right balance between providing enough transparency into data so that, sorry, what's the right balance between providing enough transparency into data so it's trusted, but also not open the floodgates of too much questions to the data team. So balance between like transparency and then questions that are coming because of that transparency. If you kind of show everyone what's out there, people are just like start asking a lot of questions on top of that. And first, is it something that you guys are seeing?
So I can take a piece of that. I think I talked about it a little bit earlier on, right? Like, to me, being transparent about data is not making it public and broadcast it to the entire organization. Um, we do have, right, our tool pretty much allows us to make that available, right? Caster makes it available to the entire organization, but we elect not to because, hey, we don't want to have a bunch of very curious folks just spend their day, and therefore we'll spend our day, right, asking about a bunch of different things that, quite frankly, is not relevant to them or to the business. Instead, right, like, make sure that you expand that and share that with the right stakeholders, the right departments, right, and expose them to the right, essentially, definitions. Make some use of some metadata tags, perhaps as well, to help you understand which departments also can weigh in and which ones can advise. That will help you, I think, prioritize or deflect some questions, and after that, redirect some of those curious folks essentially to their respective departments or to the different parties, essentially, right? Because you're here producing data, defining things, but you're doing that in conjunction with the other departments. You're not the one actually saying, this is how we calculate revenue, right? This is a collective, essentially, decisions by the company. So if you have floodgates coming in saying, hey, like, can I get access to this? Can I get access to that? At the end of the day, it comes down to the business use case. Do you need, are you a stakeholder or not? If you're not, right, like, then gently redirect them to, hey, go talk to your boss and make that business justification, so that if that's the case, then we'll build a query for you, giving you access to the information that you need, not just all the opportunities or the organization and the entire customer book of business or whatnot.
Yeah, so I think I've got two answers to that. One is the distinction between transparency and filtering. You know, ideally, you're filtering the data experience that people have so that they have access to what they need, and that data is transparent in terms of what it's supposed to be and where it came from to make it more trustworthy. If you just give everyone access to everything, it's a lot of noise, and it makes it very hard for people to figure out what should they even start to look at. So being organized and having some filtering there can be very helpful, so that individual people sort of, if they've got their blinders on, they've got all the data they need to operate super effectively within that, but don't necessarily have access to everything. The second answer is, I don't think that there is a single right balance between transparency and access. One of the things that my team has is the data quality tools to basically automatically, if there's an issue with an upstream source, automatically say, like, there's an incident. But we don't do that because there's a judgment call around, what counts as an issue. And there, if the data is going to be late an hour and it doesn't matter for someone, it would be noise to tell them. So the question is, well, what's the signal to noise ratio of, especially on the technical side, of transparency? And there, you don't want to be too transparent, but you also don't want to be not transparent enough. As far as questions, I found that the more trust and transparency there is, we're still overrun with questions, but they're much more interesting and hard.
Yeah, I mean, let's face it, yeah.
It's kind of just changing the level of the questions that are being asked. It doesn't like decrease the number of questions. It's really a like different kind of level of questions. Before it was like
they make it more pertinent. That's the thing. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah. So it brings to the table, it's like, hey, like that actually doesn't really reflect the reality. It feels like, I don't know, the definition for like the organization of revenue is that, but then in that dashboard it really seems different, and kind of like helps everyone go into the same direction. So I think that's really interesting. Cool. A second question that was, I think, really interesting is question around like, sometimes it's easy to build trust, and I'm saying easy, but it never is easy to build trust. But sometimes it's easier to build trust when we start from scratch than when we inherit like a bunch of mistakes from the past. So where do you start to rebuild trust when it's been like a bit shaky or lost from like past mistakes? Where do you start in that journey? Because I think that's really hard.
Yeah, I would say start with the people. And I say that as a huge data nerd. I think that the data technology is fascinating. It's very interesting. And the ways that we manage and manipulate data, very interesting. But at the end of the day, from an organizational perspective, data is instrumental. We use data because it allows us to do other things or make decisions about how we're doing other things. And so there, people want to use data. So if people don't trust the data, it helps to align yourself with those people and build that relationship and understand what are they trying to accomplish. And then you can use that information, that knowledge of their goals, to make the data support that. And oftentimes, if people are in their lane with their blinders on, there are usually only a couple of things that they're really trying to do. If they have too many goals, they're not being effective. And so there, it can be surprisingly easy to take a very narrow slice of all of your data and make that trustworthy to support their specific goals.
Yeah. To me, I think it once again, it's going to be keep it super simple.
I was gonna say that.
It's my go-to, just like the why. But now, really keep it super simple. Like if you have, or when you have, I think a loss of trust in the data, it's probably because there's a misalignment in the level of maturity of the data that is asked of you and what you can produce. Right. So you got to go back to the basics. Try to work with the different parties to understand what they want, explain to them what you can do, and start with smaller data sets, smaller queries, right? Instead of like trying to figure out all the compounded revenue numbers that you can bring, right? Like federated with all the partners or whatnot. How about you just focusing on this one metric, right? And get to agree with folks like this is how we can do essentially that calculation, for instance. Also, obviously, there's part of ownership as well. You got to own up to the shortcomings, essentially, that the data that you produce essentially generated. So if there are some gotchas, and there are always some gotchas into a data set, right? Like you have to document it and be like, okay, we did not actually think about this condition, for instance, where that revenue could be skewed over here because of parameter XYZ, for instance, right? And equip yourself with the owner or the owners of the data sources that are coming to that where the data is coming from, pretty much, and treat them as consultants to help you understand better how their systems function, so that you can translate it to something that is going to be a whole lot more relevant to the business. So cool. that would be my answer.
Yeah, I love it, because I was gonna say, like, I'm gonna like give like Nikki's advice, just keep it simple and start small. I think there's also like an opportunity behind that, is like, if you know that like lost trust has been lost in the past, that's actually an opportunity to just learn why that happened, and kind of identified the few elements that were really important into that loss of trust, so that it helps you really understand like what will be the elements that will help rebuild, on top of which like you will be able to rebuild that trust. If you identify like the key core moments where trust was broken, then you can kind of start addressing those, and really be focused on specific use cases, specific like um, moments, projects on which lost trust was lost. So that's I think one thing. The second one I think is interesting, is around like communication. Really like acknowledging the fact that there's been a loss of trust within the company around the data space, just being like super honest about what's happening, and what are the steps taken to improve that, so that people know like what is to be trusted, know the roadmap to like get to that trust, know where the company is going, and also like manage their expectations into the fact that, like you mentioned, Nikki, like maybe we'll start doing less but better quality from there, and that whatever is going out from the data team will be like highly trustable, but that it might not come as fast as before. I think that's interesting. Last question before the end, because we're starting to get to the end of this conversation, unfortunately. Who on your team is responsible for transparency and trust, and what types of roles does each person have in making that happen?
So, to me, everyone is responsible, but not just in my team, all the stakeholders, right? It's trust is a byproduct of transparency and data quality, right? You cannot just get trust, right? It's earned, and it's earned with the quality essentially of the data. And the quality can only be done with having the right transparency and the right definitions. So whenever you have in my organization, we have obviously that's ingrained in our core values, so that's usually like repeated quite often, right, throughout like all of our like core announcements and stuff like that. But otherwise this can be reinforced, and this needs to be reinforced with change management, right? We're talking about like just pure like communications and interactions, making a full campaign essentially to make sure that people understand what does that mean and how essentially will behoove them to act that way. um, and from there, right, I just iterate. If you have some specific issues with specific folks, right, you have multiple options. The first one, of course, is like, call them out, but that's not going to be very constructive. So, being able to highlight in a way that, you could have multiple outcomes, for instance, with a very vague request that somebody tells you, right? So you can point that out, again, not very constructive. The other option is to help them gather the requirement and refine the requirement, right? Like write a requirements document based on their very vague thing, and just keep on refining it until, right, like with them, of course, like submitting it back to them, being like, is it what you mean? Like, what do you mean you want, this, that, for instance, right? And help essentially refine that so that you can get the right vision from them, and then share it with the rest of the team, see if everybody agrees, right, to gain that level of transparency. Um, so that will be my avenue.
Nikki, you stole my answer in that everyone is responsible for transparency
Sorry.
and trust. But at the same, like, I think that's part of just being a professional, is standing behind your work. So when an analyst delivers a report or builds a dashboard, they stand behind that. And when my data engineering team delivers a data set, we stand behind that. And ideally, whoever owns the data upstream stands behind the quality of the data. But at the end of the day, it is also, slightly faster to take shortcuts in the short term. So if you skip documentation or skip quality checks, you can go just a little bit faster. So there is, I think, a tension there, in that if you spend too much time on documentation and building that transparency, you can get less done. But longer term, that trust and transparency allows you to go faster, onboard people faster, really a lot more speed to do things right. And it's everyone's responsibility, but at the end of the day, it's a leadership as well. If someone is cutting corners on documentation, that's on that person's manager to say, no, this is not an acceptable place to take that shortcut. You need to go back and add the documentation. Or for the manager's managers to say, you need to build a culture of trust and transparency with your data. And so at a certain point, leadership needs to say that an organization has to care about documentation, about knowledge management, and about doing things right.
Cool. Yeah, love those answers. Awesome. I think we're getting to an end. Thank you so much, Will and Nicky, for those really insightful conversations. Thank you, everyone, for coming. There was like a lot of super interesting concepts in this discussion, and we'll be sending the recording after the session, so don't hesitate to just like go back to it and just like go through the different concepts that we've been talking about. I'm thinking right now about like the KISS methodology or those kind of things. We look forward to seeing you next time. It was really a pleasure. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you.